All right, I think we're getting closer. Will, you want to kick us off?
Let's do it. All right. Well, so hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for enduring our banner here as we get set up. You know, this is a new brave world we're living in with this remote NashJS life we're living. Huge thanks to Chris for joining us tonight and giving a talk. We're going to do a deep dive into some awesome modular CSS techniques. It's B.E.M, right, Chris? Is that what we're looking for?
Yep, we're talking about B.E.M.
Awesome. Well, cool. So we're going to do some, like I said, talks on CSS modularity, and I don't really have many announcements for us. Do you have anything to share? I think we're always looking for speakers, as always. So if you're interested in that, reach us out on the Twitters or on the meetup.com page, and there's a form on there you can submit, and we'll get you added to the schedule. And yeah, I think that's it. That's all I got. Russ, do you have anything?
No, go vote.
Yeah, go vote. We're not telling you who to vote for, but we're telling you to go vote. So do it. Do it today. Actually, skip the talk and go vote right now.
Yeah, don't even watch this talk.
Yeah.
Get your ass out there.
Oh, no. Take your phone and watch the talk while you're in line, and then
there you go.
Preach the gospel of NashJS while you're in line to vote. There you go. Got it. Well, so without further ado, Chris DeMars, right? Salt and Burnham on Twitter. Take it away. Appreciate you, man.
Cool. Thank you so much. Well, before I get started, if it's the morning, the afternoon, the evening to you, if you're drinking coffee, water, alcoholic beverages, pop. That's right. We say pop up here in the north. It's not soda. Cheers to you if you're watching. Since this is an after hours meetup, this is all me. I'm not representing anybody but myself. Huge thank you to NashJS. I appreciate all of you bringing me in, having me come and speak virtually. 2020 has kind of thrown us a curveball. I wish I could be in person. I love Nashville, or I like to say Nash Vegas. I know, like, oh, Nash Vegas, you're such an outsider. Yeah, whatever. It's Nash Vegas to me, just like Knox Vegas. But I wish I could be there in person. I wish I could be there with all of you. I definitely miss everybody that is on the speaker circuit. I miss everybody that's in the developer community. Wish we could be there together, but hey, we're here. We're virtual. Let's have as much of a good time as we can. So huge thank you to NashJS for bringing me along. A little bit of a disclaimer. If you didn't already know from who I am and my brand, I love CSS. I love CSS a lot. I love CSS as much as I love accessibility. I probably love accessibility a little bit more than CSS, but accessibility in CSS is my wheelhouse. Why do I love CSS? Well, that's a great question, Chris. Why do you love CSS? I started building on the web a long time ago, and it was just as a hobby thing. 1996 is around the time I started building on the web. I first started off with QBasic, and then I kind of moved into HTML. We really didn't have CSS. JavaScript really wasn't a thing, at least to 11-year-old Chris. I didn't know about CSS. I didn't know about JavaScript. All I knew was HTML, hypertext markup language. And even then, it really wasn't semantic. We did things not the greatest, stuff that you would kind of look at today and be like, oh, that's kind of gross, dude. We would capitalize every HTML element and nothing would be indented. And we used to inline stuff. And that was great. I loved that web back in the day because you could just do whatever you wanted. At least as a hobbyist, you could do whatever you wanted. But then CSS and JS came on the scene and things kind of shifted a little bit. CSS shifted a lot, or the web shifted a lot with the advent of CSS. There are tons of wonderful things that you can do on the web today with CSS. And I do give a talk about that. I give a talk called Believe in the Power of CSS, where I talk about all the sweet things that you can do with CSS that you do not need JavaScript for. I'm not a JavaScript developer. I love JavaScript, don't get me wrong. I know a few of you are probably like, yeah, okay, whatever, Chris. But I love all my friends who are JavaScript developers. I admire all of you. But there's a lot of stuff you can do with CSS that you don't need JavaScript for. CSS custom properties or variables, grid, flexbox, variable fonts. There's so many dope things that you can do today with CSS that you don't need JavaScript for. And I'm here to talk about it because it needs to be talked about. I believe this is the official hashtag for the event, hashtag NashJS. If you are following on Twitter, and I hope all of you are out there, I hope all of you are on Twitter, because if you want to get a hold of me, it's the only place you're going to get a hold of me is on Twitter. That's where we live. That's where I live. I'll answer questions. So if you are tweeting or, quote tweeting, and I would say taking pictures, but we're not at a physical event. So maybe if you're doing screenshots and you're tweeting about the event, throw NashJS on there. I would really appreciate it. I like to see that interaction. I like to see that engagement. Also, this is a big one for me. I love the developer community. If you could also throw the hashtag developer community on any tweets, that would be much appreciated. You're the reason I am doing what I do. I gave a talk earlier today for Connect Tech, which is the same talk. So if you saw the talk at Connect Tech this morning or this afternoon, you're seeing it again today here at NashJS. I love the developer community. The developer community means so much to me. I speak all around the world on accessibility and CSS. Now I'm finally getting paid to do that as a developer advocate. But before, I did it on my own. It wasn't my job to speak, but I made that sacrifice because I love teaching, I love mentoring, I love spreading the word of the web, I guess you could say. And I love being out there in the community with all of you. And that's kind of why it sucks doing virtual events, because I can't be with you one-on-one. Talking to a camera isn't the same. But I'm here, you're there, and you're soaking in that information, and that's great. And if you know everything I'm talking about today, even better. Maybe you know something I don't know. So drop that knowledge on me a little bit. Just don't be an ass about it, because I have a strict code of conduct. Don't be a jerk, and we can just move on with our lives. So throw hashtag developer community on those tweets. I really appreciate it. One thing I do want to cover before I actually get into the full talk is how developers like myself are viewed in this industry. Now, I'm a front-end developer. I've been a web developer for 25 years. I don't specialize in JavaScript. I don't specialize in Node or React or Vue or Angular or Preact or Batman.js. I specifically focus on semantic markup, CSS, preprocessors like SASS and LESS, accessibility, design systems, and UX. That is what I do. But I've been told I'm not a developer because I don't write JavaScript. And that is a bullshit statement. This is a tweet from Mandy Michael. This was from CSS Conf AU back in 2018. And she was in a talk by Ivana McConnell. And what she took out of this was, and what I like to highlight the most is, CSS is a key development skill. We are here as developers because we have a skill. And too many times we're told that we are not valued in this industry because we only write CSS or we specialize in CSS. And that's just wrong. CSS is a key development skill in this industry. It makes up 1/3 of the web, and HTML and CSS make up 2/3 of the front end. It's not just all JavaScript. This is something that we have to keep into consideration. Here's another one. Another tweet from Mandy Michael. A really thoughtful closing talk by Ivana McConnell. She talks about the perceptions that we have about CSS, developers, and the web, but also the problems with how we devalue things like CSS or people whose web journey is not the traditional archetype. The one thing that I want to highlight here is also the problems with how we devalue things like CSS. This is not a skill set to be devalued. I am not here to be devalued, and neither is Mandy, and neither are all of the other amazing developers out there who specialize in this part of the front end. This is a valuable skill set. And I am here to tell you that we are not here just to be brushed up to the side as non-developers or quote unquote designers. We care about the web, we care about all the parts of the web, and we're here to make the web a better place and make it accessible as well. Now, if you can raise your hand, please do. I'm a huge accessibility advocate, so I always say before all my talks, I'm going to be asking questions. If you can raise your hand, please raise it. If not, it's not a big deal. But if you can raise your hand, if you've seen this before, it's kind of like the evolution, quote unquote, of CSS. And I found this online a couple years ago. I just want to know how we got from this right here to this up here. Think about that for a minute. CSS to style components. I was just having a talk earlier today with my buddy, JB, Johnny Bell. He works over at Weed Maps. And we were talking about CSS and we were talking about style components. And he even said, you know, it's all CSS at the end of the day. When you realize this and when you really, really think about this, you still have to understand specificity. You still have to understand the cascade. You still have to understand what CSS works. At the end of the day, it is CSS all the way down. CSS is still a thing. It's not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. And if you don't agree with that, my DMs are open. Please let's chat. Thank you for attending the talk. It is called Block Element Magic, CSS Modularity for the Masses. This is an oldie but goodie talk. I've decided I wanted to revive this talk this year. I haven't been seeing a whole lot of talks about B.E.M, a lot of talks on CSS, but haven't been seeing a lot of talks about B.E.M or CSS architecture. So I wanted to bring this out of retirement and give it a go again. My name is Chris DeMars. You can catch me at Salt and Burnham on Twitter. If you're a Supernatural fan, you'll understand that reference. I am a developer advocate. I work at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. I used to have a slide that talked about me as a person to let you know that, like, I'm human just like you. You know, I'm not up on stage or sitting in this chair blowing smoke. You know what I mean? I'm not up here just clicking a slide and talking like this and killing you with slides and bullet points. No, that's not me. I'm in your face. I'm loud. I love being in a room with everybody. And I like talking about myself just a little bit, not to inflate the ego, but to tell you I'm a human. And I got some feedback one time from an event. And the feedback was pretty much like, Chris, we don't care about you. We care about your talk. And that hit me in the feels pretty hard. At that point, I removed all that stuff. They don't care about me. Why am I even speaking anymore? If they don't care about me, why do I care about them? But that didn't stop me from caring about you as a developer or as a web worker or anybody that touches the stack of the community. So you know what? I decided to put that stuff back in. So a little bit more about me. I'm an international speaker. I speak a lot about accessibility all around the world. I also speak a lot about CSS. I'm a Google developer expert. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm also a media developer expert with Cloudinary. I love horror and I love tattoos, if you couldn't tell. I also host a podcast called Tales from the Script. You can follow on Twitter, TalesFT Script. You can also listen on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, or Google Podcast, whatever that is. Let's see what else. A couple other of those streaming services. But yeah, I haven't recorded a podcast in a minute. I stopped recording when COVID hit, when I was living in Denver. I plan on, rehashing and resurfacing the podcast, get the speakers and get my guests back up on off the docket. So if you want to check that out, definitely give it a listen, subscribe. I've had a lot of amazing speakers on there. So yeah, give that a listen. Thank you. I do want to touch on one thing. Please, please, please do not do this. This will not fix your shitty CSS. Now, there are a few different schools of thought on when you can and can't use important. Some say never use it. Okay, that's cool. Some say only use it if you have only one class and you want to keep a certain style and you only want that one class to do one thing, like an error message. An error message is supposed to be read. That's a thing. You might throw an important flag on that or an important blurb on that, whatever they call it nowadays. Now, some say you can use important to overwrite frameworks. Not JavaScript frameworks, but CSS frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation, which is cool. You can actually do that. If you need to overwrite anything that's coming out of Bootstrap or Foundation, you can use important to do that. Harry Roberts is a great developer. If you don't follow him on Twitter, definitely follow him, CSS Wizardry. He wrote an article on his website called The Importance of Forcing Immutability in CSS, where he discusses the uses of important and its intent. So if you want to check that out, the link is right here. Like I said, I also have the slides out there. If you check my Twitter, you can find the slides. But definitely give that a read. It's really great information. Let's talk about B.E.M for a minute. B.E.M, I know. One more acronym that we need, right? I know what you're thinking. WTF. Here's another Supernatural reference if you're a Supernatural fan like I am. WTF is right, but think about it. Really think about this. How many acronyms do we have out there? Right? How many? Well, let's find out. Just a short list. We have B.E.M, we have SMACSS, CSS, we have MERN, HTML, DHTML, not really, XHTML, XML, PHP, MySQL, your SQL, NoSQL, CSS, CSS3, CSS4, maybe, ARIA, AWS, TDD, BDD, SAS, JAM, not Jelly, JSON, ES6, ESPN, and last but not least, ESPN2. Huge shout out to Brad Frost for the idea for that slide. I watched him do this exact same slide with a few different acronyms a couple years ago to talk, and I thought it was hilarious. So I wanted to integrate it into this talk, which I did a couple years ago. So if you're not following Brad on Twitter, give Brad a follow. Amazing person. So yeah, huge thanks to Brad Frost for that idea for that slide. B.E.M was started at Yandex as a way to scale and support the code structure as projects grew. It was created to reuse existing code, and it was created to make changes with minimal cost to design updates. That's where it started. Yandex is the company. So what does B.E.M mean? What does it stand for? What does this acronym B.E.M stand for? B.E.M. Well, it stands for Block Element Modifier. Well, that's cool now, Chris, but you know, what do you think it means in your opinion? Well, in my opinion, it's a syntax. It's an architecture. It's semantic. And it's a methodology. Now, let me go back to syntax. Why is syntax, Chris? Well, a syntax is an arrangement of words and phrases that correctly structure a document. Sort of like a CSS file, right? Architecture. Well, this is a debatable one. Not so much by me, but by others, of course. Why an architecture? Well, in its simplest form, architecture means the design of something, right? I'll touch on the architecture debate in a few slides, but it's actually a really good debate and a really good topic to talk about when you're talking about front-end architecture and CSS architecture. It's semantic. When I say that B.E.M is semantic, I mean developer semantics. Just like semantic elements in HTML have meaning, so do naming classes when we're talking about B.E.M. When you're talking about specific properties and styles, the style declarations, that stuff is automatically going to be semantic. Margin top is whatever, right? Margin top means it is going to give a top margin to whatever element that's applied to. That will take that class or take that styling. You can name a class anything you want. HW204, right? That means nothing to me. That means nothing to you. When you're naming your classes, you have to have a little bit of developer semantics. Think about what the meaning is behind what that class is doing. And then methodology, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. So we have some naming conventions. The most popular naming conventions associated with B.E.M is or are the double underscore double dash. So you have the block, double underscore element, double dash modifier. Double underscore separates the block from the element, as you can see here. And the double dash separates the element from the modifier. Now I've seen this as well in a while. Block element modifier where it's the single dash or the single underscore and the single dash. So I've seen both of these out there, double, double, single, single. So one thing to be careful of is if you're going to be using the single convention is if you have something like body copy, right? You have card underscore body dash copy that you have to separate with a dash. You can do it this way, where you separate it, where it's kind of camel cased or train cased, whatever the case may be. No pun intended. So it's card is the block, underscore, and then the element is body copy. Then if you did have a modifier, you can throw the double dash or the single dash on there. In this case, it'd be the single dash to do the modifier, just so you can kind of keep things a little bit organized. Now, going back to the architecture debate, I got into a small argument one time with a couple of architects at a company about the front end and front end architecture and CSS architecture, and how, in my opinion, in the opinion of many other workers on the web, that there is such thing as a architecture for the front end. Web architecture does not have to mean the whole entire front to back to middle, any of that. Yes, that's part of the whole architecture, but you can have a back end architecture, you can have the middle and in the front end, right? According to them, there is no such thing, or there wasn't a such thing as a front end architecture. And I didn't agree with that so much. There needed to be a way to bridge that gap, right? And that kind of comes down to education on what front end architectures are. I mean, at its simplest sense, right? The complex or carefully designed structure of something is architecture. Or the aim of a component template object-oriented architecture is to be able to develop a limited number of reusable components that can contain a range of different content types. There is such thing as a front-end architecture, a CS architecture. And if there wasn't, there wouldn't be books about it. This is a great book by Micah Godbolt, Front-End Architecture for Design Systems. If you don't have it, I suggest picking it up. It's not a big read. It's a shorter style book from O'Reilly, but it's a great book. And it talks about all of the different types of front-end architectures for the front end, of course, but design systems. It covers, markup and CSS and JavaScript and all that stuff. And if you're also looking for another book as well, Brad Frost wrote a book called Atomic Design. It's a really, really great book too. Not a big read, but still, those are, if you are a front-end dev or you are a UI dev or even a UX engineer, UX developer, or any developer for that matter, having those books in your arsenal, in your library, is great. They're a great addition. So when I go back to talking about semantics, when I talk about semantics in regards to CSS architectures and frameworks, two things come to mind. Developer semantics versus HTML and CSS semantics. And this question, right here. Is there really such a thing as CSS semantics? There is such a thing. Like I was saying before, when you're creating classes in CSS, if you are as specific as possible and describe what the component is or what it does, you're implementing developer semantics within your code base. Developer semantics are what B.E.M and SMACSS and OOCSS are based off of. When you're creating these classes, stick with developer semantics. Make sure you're writing something that makes sense. And we're going to see a code example later down the line of a WAT example where we don't really know what is going on. But hey, it worked, right? Back to the methodology. Methodologies take the guesswork out of something, in my opinion. They make it easier to figure out how things, they make it easier to figure things out and how they work. The definition right here from Merriam-Webster: a set of methods, rules, or ideas that are important in a science or art, a particular procedure or set of procedures. Kind of all makes sense if you really think about it. So yeah, this is a bad example of writing helper classes. The person who wrote this, they coded themselves into a corner by writing highly inflexible and verbose code that achieves relatively little, even though you could say a couple of these classes are semantic, but if they are semantic, when the values change, when those styles change, the class also has to change. This is a screenshot of some code that has been out there probably a few years back. This is a piece of code that I found, and I'm not really sure what's happening. But these were clearly written to just nudge pixels around, right? There are ways to fix this though. Use Flexbox or Grid to center the contents. I'm hoping we're all familiar with Flexbox and Grid. If not, there are tons and tons and tons of resources out there on Flexbox and Grid. Rachel Andrew, let's see what else. There's stuff out there that Chris Coyer has put out, the Flexbox and CSS Grid Guide. Jen Simmons has amazing content out there. All people you should be following, videos you should be watching. Miriam Suzanne, she has amazing content out there as well. Definitely check in the Flexbox or Grid if this is your first time coming into the world of CSS and how to do certain things. Decide on consistent margins for components. This is a big one, right? Collaborate with your design team to establish those consistent standards. And if you're going to use multiple margins or paddings or spacing, helper classes or helper styling, establish consistent spacing for that. Like incremental values, maybe 5, 10, 15, or 2, 4, 6, whatever the case may be. But try to keep things as consistent as possible. Like I said, this is a WAT moment right now. WAT is going on with this CSS. Well, let's go through this again. Here's another question. If you can raise your hand, who is familiar with the media object? I am. I've seen it. You've seen it all over the place. We're going to talk about the media object with B.E.M and Flexbox. And some of these demos I'm going to show you are using B.E.M and Flexbox. This is sort of what a media object looks like. Really, this is what a media object looks like. It's usually a UI component comprised of an image, maybe a heading or a subheading, body copy. Nicole Sullivan coined this term in 2018. If you're not following Nicole on Twitter, Stubbornella is her username on Twitter. Definitely give her a follow. She coined this term in 2010 while working for Facebook, and it really changed the face of the card, quote unquote, type of experience from then on out. 20 years it's been since this term was coined. Term was coined. It's amazing to see how far the web has come. So this is kind of how it goes right here. You have the green, which is the image. You have that heading or you have that subheading. And then you have that body copy. And these components right here make up that media object. These different objects make up this media object right here. So let's talk about the structure of a B.E.M component using that media object or an example of a media object. For example, the first letter of the acronym stands for block. Now think of the block as the shell or the skin that makes up the component. So right here, div class equals card. We know that the block is going to be the card, first and foremost. Now then we have the element, the second letter in that acronym. An element can be an image, heading, subheading, body copy, etc. This is the child of the block. As you can see right here, card underscore underscore image container underscore underscore heading underscore underscore body dash copy. These could also be blocks as well. But right now we're talking about elements. And in this example right here, I'm not throwing in the accessibility. I'm not throwing in semantic markup because I'm strictly talking about the layout of the actual card itself. This could be an aside, this could be a section, this could be an article. But the way I'm doing this is it might not have that semantic markup, right? And if you don't have semantic markup, you're going to want to move into the ARIA area. And ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. First rule of ARIA, though, is do not use ARIA. Use semantic markup anytime that you can use semantic markup. But in some cases, if you can't for specific types of widgets, you're going to have to use a div. and you're going to want to bake in ARIA. But instead of throwing tons of stuff in the pot, I just want to focus strictly on block element modifier and how that kind of looks as far as that structure goes. And then we have M, which stands for modifier in the B.E.M acronym. A modifier can include color, size, weight, etc. of that element. So it represents a different state or look of either the block or that element. So right here. So in this example, I italicized the body copy. I bolded the main heading of this. I added a drop shadow to the image. I modified that element. I didn't totally change the whole element. I'm just tacking on a modifier to that class. And here we go for the modifiers. We have card heading bold and card heading secondary. These are how you identify the modifiers. This is a great quote by Stephen Hay, and I love having this in this slide deck. We are not designing pages. We're designing systems of components. Now think about what that means for a second. It's a very powerful statement. When I started, we were designing pages. I would design a full page, everything centered in the middle, really, really small fonts, colors that didn't work. That was a page. I wasn't thinking in patterns. I wasn't thinking in components. Everything is a pattern nowadays. It doesn't have to be symmetrical in order to be a pattern, in my opinion. But when you can start to identify these patterns in your design, and you can start to architect the best solution to roll out your own CSS. So a couple of the cool things I like to talk about, we talk about reusability. You can reuse this component all across your application if you wanted to, because it's made to work that way. You don't have to customize one card to be one way and another card to be another way with all different types of CSS. This can be reused across the board. Style naming, be as specific as you want, but make sure that it makes sense. Remember developer semantics. Card image container, copy container, heading bold. We know that these elements in these modifiers belong to each one of their parents all the way up the CSS stack. Be specific about what the class is supposed to style. This is one of the things that trips up people when it comes to CSS, and this is, in my opinion, a lot of times why people go to styled components, or they don't want to write CSS or CSS and JS. I'm not a fan of any of that. I'm also not a JavaScript developer. I am old school, write your CSS. CSS modules is great. But a lot of the times it trips people up because of the cascade and inheritance, stuff like that. This can help with that without having to worry about the specificity. We have concepts like separation of skin and structure, just like OOCSS, Object-Oriented CSS. B.E.M also follows the same principles of separating the skin and structure. Like I was saying, just like OOCSS, which stands for Object-Oriented Cascading Style Sheets. Thank you, Nicole Sullivan, for that. Separating skin and structure sounds a little confusing. I know it was confusing when I first learned about OOCSS a few years back. What this means is instead of styling semantic elements like the structure, you should never style elements like the image element or an H1, H2, H3. Never style those specifically. Create a class to keep the skin, the markup, or the skin, the CSS, separated from the structure, which is the markup. It'll make it a lot more easy. I won't say easy. It'll make it a lot more painless to manage your code base and your markup in your CSS. This way it can be changed depending on the image or the skin of it, right? Separating the container and the content. Now, if you look at a heading level element like an H2, right? And the content within it, this kind of goes back to the other argument. You don't style the H2 directly, right? You create a class that describes that H2. Downfalls. Do we have downfalls with this? Of course we have downfalls. Everything in tech has downfalls. Everything on the web has downfalls. Nothing is 100%. It never is. The one downfall is the chaining of classes, sort of like this. It causes a lot of bloat, right? But chain classes equals acceptable bloat. Tell everybody, I can't see everybody, but a lot of people love Tailwind and tachyons. Tailwind, you just tack on a bunch of classes to an element. It does what you want it to do according to how Tailwind tells you to do it. If it's acceptable bloat for Tailwind, why can't BEM be acceptable bloat as well? But the great thing is that it's very specific without the hassle of specificity. And that's one of the things that trips people up is specificity in the cascade. So by now you should be like, yeah, this is sweet. I don't have to worry about specificity when using BEM because I'm writing developer semantic CSS and I don't have to worry about one thing overriding another. I am fully on board with this. Now, besides BEM, there are other methods out there that we can use. We have alternative methodologies, alternative architectures that we can use. One of them being atomic design. We have SMACSS, we have OOCSS, and then we have Inuit CSS, just to name a few. Now, atomic design was developed by Brad Frost, and it's a design system that consists of 5 parts. We have atoms, we have molecules, organisms, templates, and we have pages. Each of them combined together to make flexible and modular components. Now, Brad released this book, Atomic Design. If you get a chance to scoop that up, definitely give it a read, check it out. Hit Brad up on Twitter. Amazing person. We have SMACSS, which stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. This was created by John Snook, Snook CA on Twitter. If you're not following Snook, give him a follow. This type of architecture consists of the base, layout, modules, and state, which is great because you can take SMACSS and you can also take BEM and pair them together. I've done this with building front-end architectures without JavaScript. I have used SMACSS and BEM together to build out front-end architectures for applications within an enterprise, it works out really well. And then you have OOCSS, Object-Oriented Framework for Repeating Patterns CSS from Nicole Sullivan. This has the 2 different principles, separating the skin and structure and separating the container and content, which I talked about earlier. And then you have Inuit CSS from Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry on Twitter. He's the creator of the Inuit CSS. The GitHub states that Inuit CSS is an extensible, scalable, SaaS-based OOCSS framework for large and lasting UI projects. If you're writing SaaS, great. If you're writing less, great. If you're writing stylus, great. I always recommend using a CSS preprocessor or even post-CSS when you're building out your CSS, when you're writing CSS. But Inuit CSS at its most basic form is a solid architectural baseline to build on top of. It's really not that bad when you architect solutions that will keep a maintainable, flexible, and modular code base. The sky is the limit for CSS. There is so much that you can do with CSS that you do not need JavaScript for. Like I was stating earlier in the talk, custom properties or CSS variables, variable fonts, grid, flexbox, all of this awesome stuff that you can do with CSS. And it's all created and all maintained and all supported by amazing, talented developers that pride themselves on this. So just keep that in mind. The sky is the limit. I do have some takeaways for you. The talk is kind of winding down. I only have a couple more slides. So a few of the things that I want you to take away from this talk, and BEM specifically and CSS architectures, is that these type of things on the front end, they could make your code more flexible, right? They can make it modular, so you can move it around a little bit. It's definitely semantic because in order to have this type of architecture, you can't just write whatever you want that you think just is margin top is a margin top. You know, the second that margin top changes, your class has to change, right? So making sure that you're writing developer semantics, making sure that those classes are semantic to yourself, to the other developer that is to support that code, and you or the other developer that has to look back at this 6 months to a year from now. And it's also organized. You can keep things very organized, especially if you're writing SASS or if you're using SASS partials to organize all of your code. You can keep things very, very organized, keep those things very, very modular. I hope you feel like this now. I feel like this every time I write CSS, every time I talk about CSS, I get the CSS feels. I hope you do too. I have a demo out there if you wanted to check it out. It's an older demo, so don't hate on me if it kind of sucks. codepen.io/christamar/pen/xvrmpo. It's a block element magic CSS modularity for the masses demo. You can play with it, change some things around, see how the block element modifiers work, change the classes around, change colors, do whatever you want, have a blast, have fun. I also have some resources out there. Everything's in a gist. So if you go to bit.ly/bem-resources, you can get the resources for this talk. Also, like I said earlier, if you're following me on Twitter, Salt and Burnham, I tweeted these slides out earlier today for an event I spoke at, if you wanted to get your hands on those. And that's my time. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Let's take any questions. There might be a little bit of a delay. But throw some questions in the chat if you've got them.
Awesome. While we're waiting for those questions to roll through, thanks so much, Chris. That was a great talk. I want to go write some CSS now. You inspired me to go and dust off my code pen or something and make some fun gradients or something.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, I will be right back. I got to take a, I'll be right back.
Got it.
Yeah, CSS is one of those things that it's definitely an undervalued skill set. I would agree with that. In like 10 years of doing this, finding good people who really know their stuff with CSS
You know who
is
comes
really
to mind
hard.
when you say that, Russ? Tom.
Yeah, I think about Tom all the time.
When we were working together at Lonely Planet, Tom was just a beast at CSS, and he could just take a design and make it really shine. It's not lesser at all. It's a completely critical part of web development, and you have to have it with modern web apps, and you have to have someone that has a really good eye for detail. So I think if you're looking to differentiate yourself out there, get really good at CSS. You can go far with it for sure, especially coupled with your other skills.
All right, so we got a great question. We'll just wait for Chris to jump right back. The other thing about CSS is if you've ever tried to maintain legacy application for any length of time, the way that people organize and write their CSS is so damn important, because if you're looking at something that was written 5 years ago, all those things matter so much to try and figure out what's going on and why. Chris, we got a question.
Yeah.
How do you coordinate Bootstrap, or you could apply that to any kind of CSS framework? How do you coordinate that with your own B.E.M implementation?
So it's always a tricky thing. Like, I am not a fan of Bootstrap and Foundation because those tools were created to get prototypes off the ground quickly, right? I am a big fan of rolling your own grid system, rolling your own everything. Because essentially, if you really break down a design system, you're kind of taking all of those pieces together of all these different types of CSS architectures, rolling your own and building a design system out of it, essentially. So when it comes to personal work, I'll look at what the project is, what are the common patterns, and I'll break those down to see what, okay, well, this is a card type element, right? Okay, well, there's a few of these on this page. So at least I know, hey, this is what this is, and this is what this is going to be. You can identify different types of button states. So you know you have a button. Okay, great. A button is the structure. You can create the button class and then have elements and modifiers within that, like a primary button or a secondary, tertiary, hover states, etc. And then you can just build off of that when you're writing your B.E.M. And you can even create a lot of those base classes. If you were using SMACSS, you can create all of those base classes in like a SMACSS architecture and then use elements and modifiers to build off of that using B.E.M, if that makes sense.
All right, let's see what else we got. Need 2 monitors for this. We had one comment that they were one of the few in their class who stuck with B.E.M, and it made it easier for everyone on the team to follow. Here's a question: is why is CSS not valued by companies? I've gotten 2 CSS related questions in interviews. I think 1 HTML question. JS, on the other hand, is very in depth.
Oh, that is a whole other conversation. Oh, you know, I don't think it's valued as much as it's because it's looked at as it's easy to do, right? Just like writing semantic markup, it's easy to do. JavaScript takes a lot more now, skill. And a JavaScript is it's not easy. Like everybody says, oh, JavaScript is easy. It's a great entry level language. Bullshit. It's not an easy language to learn unless you're grinding all the time to write it. But CSS is just looked at as, oh, if this person can do it, anybody can do it. Or we don't have to write Semantics CSS or Scalable CSS now because we can write CSS in JS and we have styled components and we can scope it to this thing. That's the problem with CSS. It's looked at as it's something that's easy, and it's not easy. There's a reason people don't like writing it. There's a reason people don't write it at all, because specificity is hard. The cascade is hard. If you don't know what you're doing, you can really screw a lot of stuff up. And I think that's kind of why it's looked down on and devalued. And also with the way JavaScript has blown up, everybody feels that JavaScript is the end all be all to the front end. And that's a lie. Straight up, I don't care who you are. That is a lie. HTML and CSS make up 2/3 of that front end. Those are the 2 things. Markup specifically was what the web was founded on, not JavaScript. And CSS came before that, before JavaScript. So I think that's what the problem is, that there's been so much focus on JavaScript. Since you can write JavaScript that outputs CSS, the skill of writing CSS is an industry problem. It's a hiring problem. And for the newer developers that are coming up in the game, their JavaScript is being shoved in their face, not the fundamental roots of what the web truly is. And I mean, I know that for a fact because it took me a long time to find, before the job I have right now, it took me a long time to find a gig. I was searching at least a year for a gig, but nobody would hire me because I'm not a JavaScript developer. I have all of this skill in accessibility and CSS, and I'm a big person in the community. Nobody gave a shit about any of that. At the end of the day, it pretty much came down to, if you can't build this in React with Redux at scale, we don't need you. We don't give a shit about what you do with accessibility. We don't care about CSS. If you can't do this, we don't need you. And a lot of my friends have dealt with that too. Amazing developers who have the same amount of years under their belt as I do, or like do amazing work with SVGs and CSS animation. If they can't do it in JavaScript, companies don't want them. And that's sad. It's sad to see the industry has turned that way. I was hoping after a couple of years it was going to get better. It might still get better. There are companies out there who hire HTML and CSS developers, and also hire JavaScript developers separately. And those companies are few and far between. But I think that's what the problem is. It's an industry problem at most.
I think there's also like people underestimate the power of CSS, and they want to do so many things in JavaScript that you're going to end up with a bloated site because you're doing all these things in JavaScript that you could actually just do in style sheets, but you don't have the expertise in CSS to even know that it's possible. So people don't even consider, oh, I should try and do this in CSS. They just do it in React. And that's something that I've seen in my own experience, is that like, why are we shipping all this JavaScript to do things that we could have achieved with CSS, whether it's animations or, you know, even simple things like figuring out how to highlight the last element in a list or something like that. People will use JavaScript to do that, and could save so much with CSS.
And then you end up shipping way more unnecessary JavaScript down the wire that you don't need to. You know, Adi Osmani has written articles about this, and he's pretty much a JavaScript person over at Google, but he's written, you know, the issues with JavaScript and shipping JavaScript down the wire. My buddy Jeremy Wagner, he has written articles on the problem with JavaScript and shipping so many bytes down to the user that are unnecessary when you can do things in a much more simplified way that is not costing the user money, I guess you could say, especially when it comes to mobile networks.
The other thing I really appreciate about CSS developers, specifically design, if I feel like if you come from a humanities background or some more of like a design sensible background, to have developers on your team that can bridge the gap between the design team and the software, the product team, and can kind of speak both languages, can be extremely valuable, because ultimately whatever software you're building is only going to be as valuable as the usability of it and how a user wants to use it. So
yep. And you're starting to see that now in the industry with the term, or with the role of UX engineers. Like UX engineers weren't a thing, right? But there are a couple UX engineers over at Google. You have CSS developer advocates at Google, like, you know, Adam Argyle and Una Kravitz. It's starting to become, slowly but surely, it's starting to become a lot more important. And you start seeing that UX engineer role and that term starting to pop up more, because essentially there's somebody that has the design chops, understands user experience, and it can also write code, you know, and that's kind of where I fall. I'm a developer advocate now, but I've always kind of coined myself as a front-end developer, UX architect, because I've always been that hybrid type of person. I've always designed my own stuff, whether I'm working on hobby projects or freelancing. I've always designed it myself, but then I've also always written the code. So I understand, you know, Nielsen's design principles, and I understand what it's like being in the user's shoes, especially when it comes to accessibility. That falls under the umbrella of UX, right? I mean, I have glasses. I use glasses at the computer. These are my assistive device. This is my assistive technology. This is my assistive device. I can't speak for everybody in that space, but that's why shipping amazing, accessible user experiences is so important. And that's one thing you always have to do. And that's one of Nielsen's design principles, is putting yourself in the user's shoes.
We had a follow-up question. What resources what resources are out there that might detail what is better done using CSS than using JavaScript?
Oh, there's I know that Una has a couple of websites out there. It might be one like you can do this with CSS and not JavaScript, or you might not need JavaScript. That's one. I'm sure there's a couple other out there that I can't really think of off the top of my head. I know that if you try to Google doing one thing in JavaScript and one thing in CSS, you might find more resources on doing that thing in CSS as far as like animations, stuff like that. But yeah, I would definitely look up anything that Una has written. I think she's at Una on Twitter. But definitely check out the stuff that she's put out there. And she works for Google. She's a CSS developer advocate, so she's got great resources.
Hey, is there anything like the CSS Zen Garden of BAS? Is like a modern version of that these days that people could look at and see good examples of CSS and see it done well?
I heard there is. I just saw something released. What was this? About a month ago, somebody revived the CSS Zen Garden project actually, and you can actually do it now with Flexbox and Grid, and I'd have to find it, but I know that the CSS Zen Garden is still out there. Let's see, CSS Zen Garden 2020. Somebody that might know, Todd Libby. If you were to hit up Todd Libby on Twitter, he might know because he's also a CSS and accessibility person like myself. Yeah, there was another version that came out of the Zen Garden this year, and it was kind of to revive that whole project. But you'd have to do some Googling.
Yeah, I'll dig into that. And for those of y'all that don't know or kind of new to CSS, the CSS Zen Garden it's basically the same semantic markup structure, and people would basically apply new CSS to the same structure, and you'd get vastly different layouts and vastly different styling. But it was really just an amazing way to like really showcase the beauty of CSS and really the power of it. And now, back in the day, Chris, I'm sure you're like me, starting off with the tables and like image maps and frame sets.
Oh yeah,
back
frames
in the day,
and tables. 1996.
So seeing CSS Garden come along, and you're like, "What the hell? What is this?" Like, you could do that with CSS.
I remember the day I went, because CSS Zen Garden is also a book, and I have the book still to this day. I remember the day I went to Borders here in Michigan, in Royal Oak, Michigan. It was either Barnes & Noble or Borders. I had some money I got from Christmas, and I bought the CSS Zen Garden. And it was a great book. And then to find out that you actually had the website that you could take that code, throw CSS on it, and create your own Zen Garden, that was dope.
Super cool. And actually, that's probably how a lot of folks, get started in the web. They do the right-click inspect element, and they're like, "What is this?" Right? And they start changing.
That's what I did. It's that when I was younger, I was on AngelFire. I only had AngelFire and CJB.net for a domain.
CJB.net, oh my God, that's a blast from the past.
I didn't have an allowance, right? And if I did have an allowance, it was like $5 a week to vacuum, clean my room, right? So I couldn't afford a host and a domain. I didn't know the internals of the web when I was 11 years old. So, but that's how I did it. View page source, and I've seen how people did it, and I had tables and frames and marquee and blink, and that's all I needed. Yep. And I made dope shit. I used to win so many awards for web rings. It was awesome.
Man. Oh man, we're gonna have to talk after this about the
guest books and counters and all that shit. Man.
Yeah.
That's when the little
the guy digging the under construction.
Under construction.
Good stuff.
Oh, I miss those days of the web.
Yeah.
Index,
it was
saving stuff. Version control was save as index.html, index1.html, index2.html. You have a whole folder full of just index.something. It was so much fun. And then I would save the text files too, because I would save the text files to have the markup, and the HTML was the browser version. So I started in Notepad, straight up Notepad on a Windows 95
No
machine.
syntax
That's how I
highlighting,
started.
nothing. Yep.
Nothing, dude. Black and white. That was it.
Those are the days. All right, man, Chris, thank you so much. This was a real treat to have you tonight, and we definitely would love to have you back. Your accessibility talk would be awesome. I know you have another CSS talk too. We'd love to have that as well. So you're welcome back
That's
anytime.
a fun one. That one I'd have to do in person because you really can't get the feel of it unless I'm in person. I play a music video before that.
Oh man,
I go. You can ask people in the industry. I've given the talk at Music City Tech. Like I go around the room playing air guitar and shit. Like that isn't an in-person talk. Trust me.
All right. Well, maybe for the first, in-person NashJS, and when we're back in butts and seats, we'll have you back for that.
Fingers crossed, man. Fingers crossed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, man.
People. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Any shout outs you want to give before we wrap it up?
Oh, let's see. Shout out to everybody out there in the developer community. I miss every single last one of you. I wish I could hug you. I know I look intimidating and I have a beard and tattoos, but y'all know I'm a big teddy bear. I just want to hug everybody. So I just want to say I miss everybody out there. Stay safe, stay humble, and cheers.
Cheers. I ran out of tea. I would cheers you. I'm all out.
I know. I've been cheers with an empty beer bottle
all night. Yeah. That's awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, everybody stay safe. We'll catch you next month, and stay tuned for the next topic.